Continuing E.A. Wallis Budge's The Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians. Chapter 4, The Egyptians at Work and at Play. The prosperity and wealth of Egypt have always depended upon its agriculture, and all the business of the country was arranged in accordance with its demands. But agriculture in Egypt depended in turn upon the water supply, and the water supply was derived from the Nile, and the annual inundation, for there was no rainfall worth consideration, and there were no fresh water wells in the country except those that were formed by the infiltration of the waters of the Nile. The Nile carried down from the highlands in the Sudan the mud which formed the soil of Egypt, which is the ancient writers correctly said, the gift of the Nile. And the Nile is today what it has ever been, the giver of food and life to every living thing in Egypt. This being so, a few facts about this wonderful river may be here given. The Egyptians called it Hape. From the first to the last, but the meaning of this name is unknown. Twisted rope, an arm, a box, a couple little lines, the extended and oh wait. Is that thing that ooh, okay. And then you have the little number 2 looking thing. It must have had a meaning, but it was forgotten at a very early period. The primitive Egyptians knew nothing about the source, or rather sources, of the river. Well, it appears they actually kind of did. You go there and, oh, well, there is a source, but and even when there were different, there were more tributaries leading into it, they still knew of those you can find, but I'm not sure if Budge had encountered that information. Their later descendants wrongly assumed that was connected to the great celestial ocean or the sea that surrounds the whole world, and that its springs were under 2 great rocks near the island of Philae, and at the head of the first cataract, as Egypt was divided into 2 parts, Ta'ue or Tata. The 2 lands are Twe, are the south and the north. So the river was regarded as consisting of 2 parts, the Nile of the south and the Nile of the north. The former was supposed to begin at the rock of Senmet near Philae, and the latter at Heliopolis under the 5th dynasty. The Nile was believed to come from Kenset, or Nubia. The entity of the Nile was called Hape, like the ways represented in the form of a man, with the breast of a woman, which indicated the entity's powers of fertility and nourishment. And there are people, there was a cult in, they basically saw unity of divinities, or all oneness, and you could look at the different things being said as masks. Sort of a ancient Egyptian take on Tawhid was their doctrine. I think they disappeared, this group did, but there was a variety of beliefs and practices in pretty much all cultures, so let's not say that nobody thought that, oh, these forms we're looking at, they have meaning, they're not really the limits of the entity, it's not the zoomorphic and anthropomorphic and arbomorphic and other sorts of attachments, or anyways. And find him to the Nile in the British Museum, Sailor Papyrus, number 2, the second, number 182. Well, 10,182, which is probably sung at the festival of the inundation. The people say, "Thou waterest the fields which Ra created. Thou givest life unto the flocks and herds. All the land drinks thee when thou descendest in rain from heaven. And we have Hape, the Nile entity to the north, in the form of a man with the breast of the woman. He has a cluster of lotus plants in his hand. The frog was a symbol of fertility and the new birth, and with the Christian Egyptians of resurrection. Well, actually, Kek and Cacao definitely had that symbolism of resurrection to begin with. So but I think, yeah, his dictionary proves that, doesn't it? Storehouses behind the corn granaries, thou hast care for the poor and the needy. Thou bring your food. When thou comest, the whole land rejoices. Thou strengthenest the great entity, Nepra. Thou makest prosperous every workshop of Ptah. Okay, yeah, I already went through that. A little further on, the hymn says that the Nile entity cannot be sculptured in stone. He cannot be brought forth from his secret place, for his place is unknown. He is not to be found in the sanctuaries. There is no habitation large enough to hold him, and the mind cannot conceive what his form is like. The name he bears in the Duat is unknown. He does not make visible his form, and to attempt to imagine what he is like is futile. Okay, that's basic mythology. So the idea that something that's a god is beyond these inscriptions, like, okay, well, we know as the Nile and stuff, but there's a metaphysical realization that we can't depict. We can't depict the metaphysical as it is. Well, some uses of metaphysical wouldn't seem so transcendent, but yeah, it's not saying that, oh, we don't know where the Nile comes from. That's not what they're saying. We don't know where the entity of the Nile is. It's like the sun. Okay, the entity of the sun. If we talk about the entity of the sun in that way, it'd be much the same words, but saying, well, we don't have any idea about the sun. We only know that spot up there that shines, which is the sun. The Nile, they knew the Nile. Because they definitely they sent, some pharaohs were definitely known to have sent crews up the Nile further than that. The principal sources of the Nile are three great equatorial lakes, which are filled by the heavy rains that fall between February and November, namely Lake Victoria, 1,130 meters above sea level, with an area of 70,000 square kilometers, Lake Albert, 630 meters above sea level, with an area of 4,500 square kilometers, and Lake Edward, with an area of 4,000 square kilometers. Now I bet you can find Egyptian names for these places. Its tributaries are the Gazelle River, which flows into it at Lake No in the west bank, and the Sobat River, the Blue Nile, and Atbara, the right bank. And there was actually a couple tributaries of the Nile, other than the main two, that's the Blue and the White Nile. There was a Yellow Nile. Wasn't there a Red Nile too? Atbara, north of the Atbara, the Nile has no other tributary, at this time. The length of the Nile is 3,473 miles, but if we add the length of the Kagera, 375 miles, which flows into Lake Victoria, and the length of the lake itself, 250 miles, as many writers do, the total becomes 4,098 miles. The Egyptians did not know the cause of the inundation and thought it was due to the swelling of the river, which was the result of the falling of a tear of the entity Isis into it on a certain night, called the Night of the Teardrop. And Perswan Twa'i Eater. I don't. Now it's said that some Muslims preserved this tradition and kept the Nile festival on the night of the 11th of Paoni, June 17th, which they called Laylat al-Nukta, the night of the drop. Well, certainly there were people that weren't Muslim among Muslim lands. Just because it's a Muslim majority doesn't mean you need to attribute the behavior of the Coptic Christians or whoever, because certainly it wasn't an Islamic festival. But the true cause of the inundation is the heavy rains that fall into the Sudan and Abyssinia. The river begins to rise about the middle of June, when the green water appears. The Blue Nile is in flood at the end of August, and the Atbara about the same time. As the result of the floods of these rivers, the Nile continues to rise in Egypt until the middle of September, and it attains to its highest level in October. It then begins to subside, but rises yet once more. Then it sinks steadily until the month of June, when it is again at its lowest level. There are 6 cataracts on the Nile. The 6th is at Shabluka. The 5th, about 30 miles north of the Atbara. The 4th extends from Abu Hamad to Kassingar. The 3rd and 2nd lie between Karma and Wadi Halfa, and the 1st extends from Filah to Aswan. The 7th, maybe it's Aswan, okay. If you're going to go whenever you have that line above the thing, perhaps consistency would help with this. The 7 mouths of the Nile were called by classical writers Pelusiac, Tanitic, Mendesian, Phatnitic, Sibonitic, Balbitic, and Canopic. The ancient Nile gauges are nilometers. Cut on the rocks at Samna under the 12th dynasty show that the floods recorded there were 26 feet higher than any flood of today. The importance of agriculture in Egypt is well illustrated by the oldest calendar used in the country. According to this, the year was divided into 3 periods, each of 4 months, which were called Apt, Pert, and Shemut, and these contained the months of July to October, November to February, and March to June, respectively. November to February was the winter season, and March to June, the summer season. During the period of the inundation, agricultural work came practically to a standstill. During the early months of the inundation, the whole population of Egypt watched anxiously the rising river until it reached its maximum. For on the height of the inundation, the prosperity of the country depended. A low Nile meant that the waters would not rise high enough to water all the cultivated land in the country. Crops would be short or light, bread would be dear, and many people would suffer hunger while they would be hungry. With a good Nile, the watering of all the country was possible, and everyone was content. An abnormally high Nile was followed by flooding, and the seed was washed out of the ground, and man and beast suffered. A succession of low Niles always produced famine, misery, and ruin to rich and poor alike. An inscription on a rock on the island of Sahal in the First Cataract tells of a 7 years famine which took place in the reign of Chasser, a king of the 3rd dynasty. Grain, says the king in his dispatch to Matar, governor of Elephantine, is very scarce. Vegetables are lacking altogether. Everything that men eat for food has come to an end, and now every man attacks his neighbor. The men who want to walk cannot move. The child wails, the young man drags his body about, and the hearts of the older men are crushed with despair. Their legs give way under them. They sink down on the ground, and they clutch their bodies with their hands in pain. The nobles have no counsel to give, and there is nothing to be obtained from the storehouses but wind. Everything is in a state of ruin. The book of Genesis mentions another 7 years' famine, and the Arab historians mention several famines of like duration in Egypt. The famine of 1066 to 1072 nearly ruined the country. A loaf sold for 15 dinars, 7 liras, 10 spent. A dinar could be like a day's pay, right? And an egg for a dinar, 10s. Okay, what is that? When all the animals were eaten, men began to eat each other, and human flesh was sold in public. Passengers were caught in the street by hooks, led down from the windows, drawn up, killed, and cooked. During the famine in 1201, people ate human flesh habitually. Parents killed and ate their own children, and a wife was found eating her husband raw. The graves were ransacked for food. Lane Poole, Middle Ages, 146 to 116. Now, I certainly do not believe in cannibalism in terms of, cannibalism, eat whatever unlawful thing just to survive. But if you have to kill people, then it's going too far. We have no record of the rise of the Nile flood, which in ancient times was necessary for the well-being of the whole country. But today, if the rise be between 25 and 26.5 feet, the whole country can be watered. The Nileometer is a pillar slab, standing in a sort of well which is cut into a scale divided into cubits. The cubit, 21 1/3 inches, and kirats. The kirat is a 24th part of a cubit. There was a very old Nileometer at Memphis, and Strabo and Plutarch mentions another famous Nile gauge at Elephantine.